The wind whistled through the tall pine trees, carrying tiny snowflakes that spun like silver dust in the moonlight. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and stepped carefully across the icy wooden porch. Winter in the mountains was always harsh, but tonight felt colder than usual. Even his breath seemed to freeze in the air. He had gone outside to bring in more firewood. The fireplace inside was burning low, and he knew the night would only get colder. As he bent down to lift a log, a faint sound caught his ear. A soft, weak cry. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again. Ethan turned his head, scanning the snow-covered ground. That's when he saw it. A small shape curled up near the edge of the porch steps. At first, he thought it was just a clump of snow, but then the shape moved slightly. It was trembling. Stepping closer, Ethan's eyes widened. It was a tiny bobcat cub. Its fur was dusted with snow, its little paws almost buried in the white powder. The cub looked exhausted, its eyes half closed as if sleep was pulling it away. Ethan knew wild animals were usually cautious, even aggressive if scared. But this cub looked too weak to run. Its breathing was shallow, and its small body shivered with every gust of wind. Kneeling down slowly, Ethan spoke in a calm voice. "Easy there. You're all right." The cub lifted its head just enough to meet his eyes. For a moment, man and animal simply stared at each other, the silence broken only by the sound of the wind. Something in that gaze felt almost like a silent plea. Without thinking too much, Ethan removed his gloves and gently scooped the cub into his arms. The little body was icy cold, almost weightless. It didn't struggle. Instead, it let out a faint sigh, as if relieved to be off the snow. Inside the cabin, Ethan set the cub near the fireplace. He placed an old wool blanket on the floor and wrapped part of it around the small creature. Slowly, warmth began to fill the room, and the cub's shivering eased a little. Ethan poured some water into a shallow bowl and placed it nearby. He didn't have meat to spare, but he found some cooked chicken from his dinner and broke it into small pieces. The cub sniffed at the food, then began to eat with quiet urgency. For the next hour, Ethan simply sat by the fire, watching the cub. It seemed unreal, a wild bobcat in his home, resting just a few feet away. The cabin, usually silent and lonely in winter, now felt different. Warmer, more alive. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the world in white. Inside, a strange new connection had begun. One born out of cold, but warmed by a simple act of kindness. Ethan didn't know it yet, but saving this cub would change his life in ways he could never imagine. The next morning, sunlight peeked through the frosted cabin windows. The storm had slowed, but the world outside was still blanketed in thick, untouched snow. Ethan stirred awake in his armchair, realizing he had dozed off by the fireplace. The first thing he did was glance toward the wool blanket. The little bobcat cub was still there, curled up like a tiny ball of fur. Its chest rose and fell slowly, the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep. Ethan smiled quietly to himself. He stood and poured himself some coffee, careful not to make sudden noises. After a while, the cub began to stretch. Its golden eyes blinked open, and for the first time, Ethan saw them clearly in daylight. They were bright and sharp, yet not fearful. "You made it through the night," he said softly. The cub didn't understand the words, but it tilted its head slightly, as if listening. It sniffed the air, then padded over to the water bowl Ethan had left nearby. After drinking, it sat and watched him in a curious way. For the next few days, Ethan cared for the cub. He fed it small meals, made sure it stayed warm, and let it rest. The bobcat, in turn, grew stronger each day. At first it kept its distance, lying in the corner near the fire, but slowly, it began to move closer whenever Ethan was sitting. One evening, as Ethan sat reading an old book, The cub quietly walked over and rested near his boots. It didn't touch him, but it was close enough to feel the warmth from his legs. That small act surprised him more than he expected. Living alone in the cabin for years, Ethan had grown used to silence. He didn't mind it, but there were moments when the stillness felt heavy. Now there was a gentle sound of tiny paws, a soft rustle of fur on the blanket, and the occasional flick of a short bobbed tail. The cub became a quiet companion. When Ethan chopped wood, it watched from the porch. When he okayed, it lay on the rug, head resting on its paws. Sometimes he caught himself talking to it about his day, even though it couldn't reply. But Ethan knew the cub didn't belong to him. It belonged to the wild. One sunny afternoon, he stood at the cabin door and looked out at the forest. The snow had started to melt in places, and the air was warmer. He crouched down beside the bobcat and said, "You're strong now. It's time." The cub blinked up at him, and for a brief second, he wondered if it understood. Then, with a small leap, it bounded into the snow, pausing only once to look back before disappearing among the trees. The cabin felt strangely empty again, but Ethan told himself he had done the right thing. The bond they had shared was short, but something deep inside him felt lighter, as if that little life had left behind a spark of warmth. What Ethan didn't know was that this spark would return to him in a way he could never imagine, and much sooner than he thought. A week had passed since the little bobcat left. The forest was waking up from winter. Snow still lay in patches, but birds had returned, and the streams were starting to flow again. Ethan tried to get back to his normal routine, chopping wood, fixing tools, and preparing for spring. But he couldn't help thinking about the cub. Sometimes, while walking in the woods, he would glance at the shadows between the trees, half expecting to see those golden eyes watching him. One late afternoon, Ethan went deeper into the forest than usual to gather fallen branches. The sun was sinking, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. He was about to turn back when a sound froze him in place. A low, deep growl. Ethan's heart raced. Just ahead, between two large pines, a large shape moved. It was a cougar, lean, powerful, and clearly not happy about Ethan being in its territory. The big cat stepped forward slowly, ears flat, tail twitching. Ethan knew he had to stay calm, but his pulse was pounding in his ears. He took a slow step back, but his foot slipped on the icy ground. The cougar's muscles tensed, ready to pounce. Then, from the trees to his right, came a sharp cry, the kind of wild call that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Out of the shadows, a full-grown bobcat appeared, bounding toward the cougar with surprising speed. Behind her, moving quickly but still smaller, came the young cub Ethan had rescued. The mother bobcat stopped between Ethan and the cougar, her fur bristling, her eyes locked on the larger predator. She hissed and growled, circling slightly. The cub stood a few paces behind her, watching intently. For a tense moment, the cougar seemed to weigh its options. It let out a short, frustrated growl, then turned and slipped back into the trees. Ethan stood frozen, hardly able to believe what had just happened. The mother bobcat turned her gaze toward him. Her eyes were sharp, but not threatening, more like they were studying him. Then, almost gently, she let out a short, low sound and looked toward the cub. The young bobcat stepped forward, tilting its head the same way it had done in Ethan's cabin. For a brief moment, Ethan felt that same silent connection, an understanding that went beyond words. Without another sound, the mother and cub disappeared into the forest. Ethan remained there for a long time, his breath visible in the cold air, his mind replaying what had happened. The cub had survived, grown stronger, and returned, not alone, but with its mother. And in his moment of danger, they had protected him. As he walked back to his cabin, Ethan felt something warm in his chest. In the wild, kindness was rare, but it had its own way of coming back, sometimes in the most unexpected and life-saving form. From that day on, whenever he heard a rustle in the woods or caught a glimpse of movement among the trees, he smiled. Somewhere out there, he knew, his small act of kindness still lived on, carried in the golden eyes of a wild friend. This way, the mutual rescue, human-nature connection, loneliness and companionship, and cycle of kindness all come full circle.